So, I'm not doing brilliantly right now. Like, I'm okay, but one of the reasons I am okay is poetry. And another reason is Star Trek. I've been feeling kind of low lately. I've been going through quite a lot of stress. I've carried on the channel completely as normal, but behind the scenes a lot of things have been going on in my life that have put pressure on me, and I can feel myself sort of teetering on the edge of depression. I know what depression feels like. I know what anxiety feels like. I've struggled with both my whole life, and right now I'm just there on the edge, and I don't want to fall in, so I'm trying to look after myself. And I want to talk about the two things that I've been engaging with a lot recently that have kept me afloat, kept me from sinking into those depths. And those two things, as I said, are Star Trek and poetry. Let's talk about the poetry first. And when I say poetry, I mean the reading and the writing of it. I've written bits of poetry here and there all of my adult life, but only about 2 years ago did I really get into reading poetry. I have enjoyed a lot of great poetry recently, almost all of it being queer or feminist, or both. And my appreciation for poetry has encouraged me to write my own, and I'm pretty confident in saying that my poetry is fucking good. I'm very happy with my poetry. I'm really proud of it. I've been attending open mic poetry nights here in Glasgow. It's a lot of fun reading your poetry out loud to a crowd. I got a few people crying at the last one, not gonna lie, I am proud of that. And writing poetry has been wonderfully, brilliantly cathartic. I've been sharing some of my poetry on Instagram and TikTok, so you can go watch it there if you're interested. I'm getting 5 of my poems published at the Poetry Lighthouse, and I am actually working on a collection. I will continue to submit my poems to different places and see what comes of it. But writing poetry and reading it out to an audience has been so cathartic. But aside from writing it, of course, I've also been reading a lot, and I want to share with you some of the poetry that I've read recently that I have really adored and which again has kept me afloat. There's something very different about reading poetry to reading fiction. Poetry has a way of relaxing me. I guess I'm not a tea drinker, but I imagine it's the difference between drinking coffee and tea. Coffee is energizing and tea is often soothing and relaxing. Well, I say I'm not a tea drinker. I don't like your standard British black tea. That thing that every British person is required to like from birth. I hate it, but I love bubble tea. And I enjoy a cup of peppermint tea before bed. So I am a tea drinker, just not that standard British stuff. Builder's tea, English breakfast tea, that stuff. I can't stand it. Anyway, I was talking about poetry. When you read a novel or a short story, it can feel quite engaging and energizing, and you get wrapped up in it, and there is an immersiveness. Immersion? To fiction. Poetry has a different effect on my mind. I can honestly feel my brain chemistry reacting in a different way when I read poetry to when I read prose. There is something soothing, and it's just as engaging, but it's engaging different parts of your brain. For one thing, reading fiction encourages empathy, but poetry feels like it encourages a different kind of empathy. It's a really weird thing to describe. I feel like I can't quite grasp it. But the more poetry you read, the more your attitude towards poetry goes from the standard, oh, I don't understand poetry, it's too clever for me, it's too confusing, all of that stuff that we all have felt at some point in our lives, over to the exact opposite, where you go, wow, this is beautiful, and it's calming, and it's soothing. You might not understand what the poet's trying to get at. You might have your own interpretation, and that's a good thing. But you're certainly going to feel calmed by it, engaged by it. You're going to cry. You're going to feel suddenly a heart full of love. That's the effect of poetry. So let's talk about some of the great poetry I've read recently. Starting off with something very unique, very powerful, very unlike anything you've ever read. This is 10 Bridges I've Burnt by Brontez Purnell. Cypher Press sent me this. They publish all of his works in the UK. About 2 years ago, they sent me his short story collection, 100 Boyfriends, which was a collection of 25 short stories about queer love, queer dating, queer sex. It's great. I've got a video on it if you want to check it out. 10 Bridges I've Burnt is a memoir of sorts, a memoir written in verse. So if you flick through it, it looks like a poetry collection on the surface, and it is. But it's also a memoir. There are 38 pieces in here. I guess piece is the best, most vague thing you could call what's in here. And each of these pieces is written in verse. There is a rhythm, there is sometimes a rhyme, but each one is just about his life. Through this collection, we get to know Brontes Purnell in a very, very intimate way. If you don't know who he is, Brontes Purnell is a black gay American writer and musician. He's really incredible, and he speaks very confidently and with a lot of humor and sometimes self-deprecation about his experiences as a gay black man. He talks about music, he talks about dating, he talks about just how much he loves sex. He talks about his agonizingly difficult relationship to his family, especially his father. He talks about his relationship to gender, to bodies, to blackness. These are poignant, confident, and kind of affirming pieces of writing. And as you read through this, you will learn about him, you will know everything about him, and there is something so empathetic and comforting in this, almost in the sense of camaraderie. As you get to know this guy, as he bears his soul, in both a poetic but also a very matter-of-fact and almost stern way, you get the feeling that you've made a friend. As corny as that sounds, I got to feel like I understood Brontes. Now, while this is called a memoir, you're not going to learn everything about his life in the traditional way that a memoir provides. It's not an autobiography. It is a collection of pieces that give you a great insight into how he has lived his life, his opinions on things, his politics, his friends and family and colleagues and loved ones. There is so much humor in here. There is a lot of lightheartedness. You get the sense that this is someone who is older, who is middle-aged, who is looking back on his 20s and 30s, the things he did right and also very much the things he did wrong, what he's learned along the way, how he sees other people, people of his own age and also younger, and all of it is written in verse as poetry. That is such a unique thing to do. And the empathy and the connection that I felt from this was uplifting. I honestly felt like all of the pressures that I felt recently, this teetering on the edge, all of this, it went away for a while I was reading this, as I felt like I was living someone else's life. And I really think that reading it in verse is what did it, rather than just reading a bland piece of prose. I was reading this as song, as poetry, and that format, that style of execution really changed how I interpreted, how I read, how I felt about everything he was saying. To give you an idea of the catharsis and the sense of humor I got from this, I'm just going to read a segment of one piece called Auntie. In the history of man, who can actually recall what group of 20-year-olds weren't raging assholes? The old-timers pretend to forget that they were assholes too, and largely still are. My baby sister loves me, despite the fact I read like a crazy old slut to her, and I always thought she knew why I was crazy. Why did I always assume we had grown up with the same eyes? The day she sheepishly disclosed that she could not recall anything that happened in the house we grew up in, I cried uncontrollably, 'cause like, oh, sweet sister, I'm not crazy. I was just the human firewall between you and the great evil of those headless fucking boomers we call mum and dad. Ah, that is my favourite segment from this whole thing. I loved that so much. I laughed, I understood it, I felt it. Brilliant. 10 Bridges I've Burnt is excellent. A really wonderful and very unique memoir presented in verse. Love it. This is The Air Year by Caroline Bird. This was actually lent to me by my friend Amelia before we moved up to Scotland. So Amelia, if you're watching this, which you're not, I really need to get this back to you. This is the kind of poetry collection that you want to shove into everyone's hands. I need everybody to read the sheer beauty and heartbreak of this collection. There are feminist poems in here, queer poems, poems of love, poems of loss, poems of self-loathing and self-love. There's a lot going on here. Some of these are very funny, most of them are quite tragic. The landscape of emotion that you explore and wander as you go through these poems is incredible. And this is the first thing by Caroline Bird that I've ever read. She's got a whole bunch of collections out. Her poetry has been published everywhere. Apparently she's also a playwright, and that's awesome. I don't know anything about her apart from this collection, but I need to read everything she's ever written and go see or read some of her plays. She has won multiple prizes. She was one of the poets at the London Olympics. She's pretty incredible. And these poems feel at times transcendent. She isn't really one for rhythm and rhyme, and as a budding poet, Rhythm and rhyme are things that I feel very tied down by, in a good way. I insist that all of my poetry has a distinct rhythm and it rhymes. I need that. But she proves that you can definitely ignore all of that. Maybe not completely, but kind of substitute it with powerful language and powerful flow, and there is still a rhythm to that. She knows what she's doing. For example, there is one poem in here called The Girl Who Cried Love. It is just a block of text. It's almost perfectly square, and it is a conversation between a lovesick young lesbian woman and a priestess of love. This young woman goes to the priestess constantly and begs for the key to another young woman's heart. And she's done this over and over again, constantly falling in love, becoming infatuated, and needing the key to the girl's heart. But she's done this with so many girls, and she promises every time it's different, this time it's real, this time it's true love. But is it ever? Will it ever be? It's a very funny, but also very relatable little story as a poem. And this collection also contains perhaps the most heartbreaking poem I've ever read, The Red Telephone. It's presented as a series of very short stanzas, and it paints the picture of a young couple, one of whom is clearly very, very depressed, very obviously so. And our narrator ignores all of it and downplays all of it until her lover isn't around anymore. I absolutely cried reading this. It is a very, very draining poem, but one that offers a valuable lesson in listening to the people around you who are depressed, who are struggling. Don't abandon them, don't ignore them, don't call them hyperbolic or anything else. They are in pain. And this poem reminds you of that. I could go on and on. The Air Year is amazing. This is honestly one of the best poetry collections I have ever read. Ever, ever, ever. And finally, here's something pretty curious. The Heeding by Rob Cohen, and illustrations by Nick Hayes. Those illustrations are astonishingly beautiful. Now, when I started reading The Heeding, I thought it was a collection of nature poetry. I really like nature poetry. It is relaxing, it is soothing, and it puts you in touch with the world around you. I'm a big fan. But this isn't that. The Heeding is actually a poem that tells the story of the year 2020. The year of COVID, the year when we were all locked down, the year of a global plague. And it's all told from the perspective of the poet. Things he saw, things he did, things he experienced. There are some really sad poems in here, some very funny ones, some heartbreaking ones, but there is constantly this link back to nature. In a way, it is nature poetry. All of the illustrations are about nature. There is a real connection to the natural world as he looks at birds on telephone wires, as he sees a hawk flying alongside his car as he's barreling down the motorway. There is a connection to nature the whole way through, especially weather and birds. Those are the two big parts of nature that recur all the way through this. But again, this is quite a cathartic collection, especially now that we're a few years out of 2020. That year that none of us will ever forget. I remember almost every moment of that year. It was something else entirely, and this collection reminds you of that. But now that we've had enough distance from it, I felt like I could read it without having a panic attack. The Heeding is gorgeous. Some of these illustrations are mind-blowing. I think this is lino printing. I tried to do it once and I was terrible at it, but I really like it. And it's all the way through. It's beautiful. And there aren't just single pages dedicated to the illustrations, but they actually kind of wrap around the poem sometimes. Like this one, this is a really sad, poignant poem about an old man dying of COVID in a hospital and the life that he lived. And it's just a picture of him fishing by a creek. But it's not all sad. There's one laugh out loud funny poem in here that really had me in stitches. It's about the poet waking up in the middle of the night because he thinks he hears his children coughing and he's immediately frightened and worried for them. But it turns out it's not coughing, it's something else entirely. He looks out the window into the alley behind his house and he sees two teenagers going at it. And the way that it's delivered is fucking hilarious. At no point does he actually say what's happening, just his reaction to it, and honestly, well, I was going to say it's poetry, but it really is. It's brilliant. So I don't think The Heeding would be to everyone's tastes, and it certainly isn't nature poetry in its purest, simplest form, but It is again something very empathetic and cathartic that made me feel a little bit better, reminded me of the struggles we went through in 2020 and looking at it from the other side. And the illustrations helped as well. They're amazing. So that's some of the best poetry I've been reading recently. I've read some others as well, but those three really stood out to me as something diverse and important to talk about. They really helped me just reconnect with my heart and my soul, and they inspired my own poetry as well. I've been writing a lot and I love every moment of it. I really, really enjoy writing poetry and I hope something comes of it. I'm entering myself into a contest. I feel like what I write is good. And I've never felt that way before. I've written loads of novels and short stories in the past, and you go back over it and you go, oh, that's shit. My poetry is different. I feel good about it. But the other thing that has helped me stay afloat is Star Trek. And honestly, I don't have a lot to say about it. I just wanted to bring up the fact that I used to really love TV as a kid. I didn't read at all as a child. I've talked about this on this channel before. I got into reading much later, in my late teens. As a kid, I was a TV and video game addict. That's how I spent all my time. I watched a lot of sitcoms, and when I was at university, I really got into Star Trek. I lived with my best friend Tom and another guy, and they were both big sci-fi fans, big Star Trek fans. They got me into Star Trek. They also got me into Battlestar Galactica. And to this day, like 15 years later, Tom, who's probably watching this, still tries to get me into Babylon 5. I don't care, babe. And I don't like J. Michael Straczynski's writing. Like, his Superman wasn't very good. Okay, fine. I'll watch it. Because I'm picturing you all sad now. I don't like it. But through all of that, the one takeaway I had after I came out of university was that I loved Battlestar Galactica. That was like the big thing. And to this day, I would still call Battlestar Galactica my favorite TV show. But I did watch Star Trek the original series, and I did watch about half of Next Generation before I became a teacher, got really depressed, and couldn't do anything with my life. Over the last few months, my partner and I have been making our way through Star Trek Voyager. And that show means everything to me now. It means the whole world to me. I spend so much of my time reading, writing, making videos, editing stuff. I'm constantly working, even when I'm not. In the evenings, my partner is sat playing a video game and I'm reading a book that will end up in a video or an article or something. Work is always there. And Star Trek has been my escape. Absolute, pure and beautiful escapism. And the thing I love about Voyager is that it has this found family. All of Star Trek is escapism because it's very positive science fiction. The episodic nature of the original series and Next Generation allows you to just fall into a strange story, episode after episode. What kind of people will they meet? What planet will they visit? What shenanigans will they get up to? What ethics will be explored? What relationships will be built? That's always fun to watch. But with Voyager, because the people on this ship are all trying to get home, and all they have is each other, that found family bond is so much stronger. And I've really felt it, and I've really needed it, and I have been addicted to it. I love all of the characters on the Voyager. They are important to me. They feel like my family at this point. This found family connection that I feel with the characters on the starship Voyager is really, really intense. And that, combined with poetry, has really kept me afloat recently. I cannot overstate how much I enjoy watching an episode or two of Star Trek Voyager every single night. But I really wanted to just take a moment here and talk about the impact of a good TV show. I haven't allowed myself to enjoy a big, epic, exciting, really long-running TV show for a while. The idea of just gently, day after day, night after night, slowly watching a TV show that I can fall into, sink into, evaporate into, and feel a little bit better and feel all of the pressures and the teetering depression, all of it just falls away for 45 minutes while I watch an episode of Star Trek Voyager. It's been really wonderfully cathartic. And I really think it's the found family dynamic of that show that's keeping me going. These characters mean a lot to me. Reading poetry and watching Star Trek, these are the things that are keeping me afloat right now, as is writing my own poetry. I hope some of you will read it or watch me perform it on TikTok or come to one of the open mic nights if you happen to live in the Glasgow area. Poetry is fixing me, or at least keeping me healed and stitched together strong enough to carry on, to keep moving every day. Poetry and Star Trek. I'm very grateful for those two things. So go read some good poetry, go watch some Star Trek. It might help you, it might heal you. I hope it does. It's doing so for me. And subscribe for books.